It's Deuteronomy 16:20. Justice, justice, you must pursue, not follow. I think the ESV is too soft here. This word is much more potent. I mean, follow is okay, but it's like follow is sort of like, there's justice. I'll be back here. And I'll be following it. No, you must pursue it. You should hunt it down, run after it. Use your energy. Go after it with alacrity, with energy. Go after it. You could be driven towards it. It's a way to sort of understand it. This is for God's people now. God's people can't agree with the principles of justice and then say, we like justice. That's not our standard. God's people have to work energetically to pursue it. Bring it. Don't just follow it. Catch up with it. Pursue. Chase after it. Drive yourself towards it. And this final half of the verse is actually more important than I think we realize. Do this so that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God has given to you. This sort of rhetorical flourish ends the whole section on justice. It doesn't end it, but it caps off this little section about building a just society. And he leaves them with this sort of promise, but it's also got implicit in it a warning. Pursue justice, so that you can live, so you can have life, and so that you can have the blessings of being my people. If you reverse engineer this a bit and you say, what if God's people don't pursue justice according to these standards? What are they going to end up with? Yeah, they're going to end up like the pagans around them who have not been given this standard. It's precisely what happens in ancient Israel. We know from the prophets. This should be a lesson for us. If the chosen people of God so dramatically failed to implement God's standards for building an upright society, how is a culture, how is a nation, how is a church that so radically abandoned these standards, just redefined them or misdefined them or ignored them, how are we going to expect any security and blessing from our God? This is should be a real heavy warning. I think that works basically to define justice for us, partly by defining what it's not. That doesn't tell us everything we need to know, but that gives us a good footing underneath us for a working definition. But with the definition in hand, now we have to decide. You have to decide if you're going to be a person of justice, a justice pursuer. To Exodus 23, what we just read in Deuteronomy is basically standards for how a governing body should implement rules so that the society can function. Right? That's really important if you're trying to build anything beyond just what I'm going to do today. So there's a corporate emphasis in Deuteronomy. Back in Exodus, you can look at this, and it actually sort of delegates down the responsibility for the same principles to the people. So there's an interesting, don't ever think, well, justice, that's the job of the people who run the government. If you don't have buy-in and participation and agreed upon definitions for the people who are governed, it all falls apart. Exodus picks this up. You, not your judges, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many, so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. You catch that? Don't get me started on not following after the crowd here. I have a deep aversion to any crowds. Like I say all the time, this is the only crowd I'm comfortable with. People gathered for worship is already a little bigger than I'm comfortable with, but this is good enough. Like, this is good, right? The bigger it gets, the less comfortable I get. But I'm really terrified by mobs, right? By large, mindless, unfocused crowds, especially if they're just yelling things or chanting slogans. I'm not saying they never do any good. I'm saying I distrust what's going to happen there, right? And just the tactic itself. But anyways, this is a call to not just simply fall in with a crowd who's calling for an outcome because they're calling for it and they're a crowd. This is a deep human danger. Humans are just susceptible to crowd influence. The more people saying we ought to do a thing, the more likely you are to be to say, yeah, I guess we ought to do that thing. The courage it takes to stand facing this way against a crowd who's facing this way and coming at you, when you know they're doing the wrong thing, or you know it's possible they're going to do the wrong thing, and you need your voice to be heard to try to get them to stop, is unbelievably difficult, right? That courage is a courage that most of us don't have just intrinsic within ourselves. You have to muster it, you have to find it, you have to work on it, or you have to be given supernatural strength to have that type of courage. This is a really big principle. But did you see how this verse 3 says, you shall not be partial to a poor man in justice. Just because someone is disadvantaged doesn't mean your decision should take that into consideration, right? If the outcome is not made on the basis of what's right and what's right alone, you have not achieved justice. And if that person is poor but wrong, and you think, I know they're wrong, but because they're poor, we should bring about another outcome, you have left the path of justice. Now, reading ahead, look at verse 6. You shall not pervert the justice due to the poor in his lawsuit. The Torah equally guards against the powerful oppressing the poor, keeping justice from the poor, just because they're poor and we're more powerful. What I just said about not favoring the poor, we have to take equally seriously in considering anybody who is disadvantaged, right? You hear all this talk about privilege. There are privileges that we should all be deeply grateful for and acknowledge. And we should never let those privileges think that because that person doesn't have them, they're on their own. It's the job of God's people to take up their cause, if it's a just cause, and help them work toward a just outcome. Not because they're poor, but because they don't deserve to be oppressed simply because they're poor. And if the people who have power over them are able to do that, somebody with some power ought to step in and try to rectify it. That would be justice. So you can't favor the poor because they're poor and just substitute poor here for any group that's marginalized. And yes, that includes racially marginalized people, which I know in legal standard we ought not have, right? I know the legal protections say there are no marginalized people in our country, but let's be honest, that doesn't mean that certain races are not particularly marginalized in some communities. Probably high time God's people, especially the white evangelical church in this country, took that seriously. You have particularly black, but also Mexican or Asian believers in your congregation or in your community. I think the answer that, well, you have all the legal protections you want since 1964, what are you complaining about? That's not good enough. Sorry. I grew up in this area. This area is not, when I grew up, there were, I think, I had two black friends in high school. They were both on my basketball team, and that was it. That was the black population of my high school. Don't tell me they didn't face difficult challenges that I faced, right? They had stuff to deal with I never had to deal with. The church ought to recognize that. And if that fact alone, their skin color, or their economic disadvantage, or some other thing, is causing people to marginalize them, if we're not the first people to step in that gap and say, you're not going to do that to this person made in God's image, then who's going to do it? This is what you're seeing right now in part. Trust me, I have no patience for leftism. Leftism is its own false religion that I detest. Just cards on the table. I don't think I have to flirt around that. But the reason it's such a powerful, animating, spiritual force in this country and in our culture is because the church, and particularly the white evangelical church, has just failed to do its job. who just failed to take people in God's image as people in God's image and step into their place and say, no, we're going to protect, we're going to defend, we're going to fight for these people. And I don't care that you're also a Christian and that you also share my politics. This person's more important to me than your ideas. It's just on us, right? It doesn't excuse any of the nonsense on the other side. But you understand, in a vacuum of justice, someone will come in and try to do it. And if it gets redefined, oh well, because we let it get redefined. Be that as it may. You can't favor the poor, but you can't discriminate against them either. Look at the emphasis here. Keep far from a false charge. This is the heart of the whole thing. Truth. Just getting to the truth is the ball game here. A lot of us are being asked right now, or expected, or sort of implicitly pressured to stand up and say things in the name of justice that, I'm sorry, we just ought not to say if they are not true, right? That would be to step into the conversation about justice and to entertain a false charge. Don't ever do that. Don't ever cave to a crowd who's screaming justice and then say things you believe not to be true just to appease the crowd. Don't do it. Do all the things I just said. Stand in the gap for people who are oppressed. Take up the cause of real justice for anyone who needs it and has a just cause, especially if they're marginalized and you have more advantage than they do. But don't ever say things you don't believe to be true just because people are asking you to. Keep yourself from a false charge, far from it. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for the bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. Catch this. You know the heart of a sojourner, a stranger, an alien, a foreigner. For you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. The emphasis on foreigners here is telling. It's important. God's people should be sensitive to those who are more at risk because they're treated as second-class citizens in a largely homogenous society. You following me? Look around. It's not entirely homogenous, but we all have a basically similar background, ethnic makeup, nationalities represented, some people with different, but we don't by and large have to worry too much about this. If you go somewhere, or if someone walks in these doors who is in some other area of their life treated as a second-class citizen, or maybe has been to some other church where they felt those believers marginalized them, then I'm telling you, they had, by God, better not be unjustly treated that way here, right? And I'm not saying this because I think we're guilty of it. I'm saying this because we need to set the example for remember what it's like to be a minority. Remember what it's like to be dislocated, to be oppressed. And God's people of all should know that because we are all oppressed by sin before Jesus set us free from it. We have to start thinking about people who are dead wrong and frankly crazy and maybe even doing bad things. We have to start thinking about them as if they are an alien, a foreigner, that we need to bring in to our community and try to set free in the way that we've been set free. That doesn't mean excuse bad behavior. It means to treat them like a person made in God's image, and particularly here, an alienated person who might be persuaded by the love of God if there is an example for how that love should be justly represented. That's good. That's the charge of God's people. James picks this up in the New Testament in a way that's just unbelievable and powerful. Now, he is directly challenging a group of believers who were guilty of this thing. My brothers, James 2, verse 1, my brothers, do not show partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there. He's a foreigner, he's a stranger, he's something other than what we really want to honor here. Or sit down at my feet. You just sit here at my feet, like you can serve me, that will be great. Thanks for coming, good to see you today. Please feel free to serve me as your superior. James says, you have not made distinctions among yourself and become judges with evil thoughts. Have you not done this? You've become a judge. But you're a terrible judge because you don't care about justice. Verse 8, skipping ahead a little bit. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of it all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Seems to be picking up Proverbs 21. Whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. Seems to be what James is saying in his more direct form. Proverbs gives it in a easy to remember aphorism, right? If justice is necessary and you pretend it's not your job, there's going to come a time when you're going to need someone to implement justice on your behalf, and God is going to say, nope, sorry. Sorry, you didn't take it seriously enough. So let me close this out. I know I'm eager. I'm animated. Frankly, it's been building up for a few weeks here, so just hear me out. If I haven't lost you yet, I'm going to try now. We have to determine to always keep justice tethered to grace. Think of Micah again. There's a real logic to that construction. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. There's a reason he doesn't just say, hey, you ought to do justice, go do it. The correction Jesus issues to the Pharisees when he confronts them, this woe. When you read that in English and you're like, whoa, that's bad. That's not what woe means to a person acting as a Hebrew prophet. It means bad news. It means something worse than that, just put it that way. Woe to you, Pharisees. For you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and the love of God. Notice how he marries them together. He couples them. These you ought to have done. That is the rituals. That is the performance of the liturgical tasks and the daily routine ritual service to God. You should have done that, right? You're religious people, so do religious things. Sure, fine, no problem. But you can't get away with being a religious person doing religious things and then not doing justice and showing God's love. And he just has at him for it. Zechariah captures this as powerfully as anywhere I've seen it. And this is, again, an indictment on a people who knew the definition of the terms and just neglected to do it. They hadn't determined that they're going to be justice people. And to the extent that they did, they thought of it only in terms of, well, we need to have a law and we need to execute the laws. And they didn't combine it with, how do you do that in the love of God? How do you carry out God's chesed, his mercy, his covenant love, and accomplish justice? So Zechariah challenges them. Thus says the Lord of hosts, Zechariah 7:9. Render true justice, mishpat. It says judgments in the translation. That's true because they're supposed to decide the right things. But you understand, it doesn't just mean making good decisions. It means truly doing justice. And Show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor. And let none of you devise evil against one another in your heart. This is not a New Testament principle expressed nearly perfectly by an Old Testament prophet. You're not going to find one, right? This is what James was talking. This is what Jesus was talking about. This is what the church ought to be about. So when I say we have to determine that we're going to do this, we have to think long and hard. We have to open our hearts and try to put something in there in terms of what exactly is that going to look like? What should we be doing here? And in the current conversation, if you can call it that, maybe more, all right, let me be more honest with you guys. In the current cultural riot that we're living through, I mean, literal riots are bad enough. When the literal riots die off or are put down, there will be a cultural riot that will be far outstripping it in momentum and endurance. We will still have to deal with a cultural riot, a chaos in the zeitgeist, in the spirit that's just permeating around us, that we're going to have to know what to do with. This doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't tell you what to do about every situation, but this is part of the problem. Right now, it's difficult for people to talk about a situation and how justice should be done in a situation, right? That's a conversation we should all be willing and frankly capable of having with anybody who asks us. But it's a challenge, particular challenge, when you are asked or you bring up, whichever it is, what is the just thing in this situation? And immediately the conversation gets turned into, all this needs to change, right? Or, well, yeah, we think justice should be done here, but these people are really terrible over here. Just change the conversation. I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to do that. I don't think we ought to be expected to say, well, yeah, we like justice, but let's just let the system work. That's my impulse, frankly. I'm a big I believe in systems. I don't like chaos and anarchy, and I think some of the reasons why are evident in our news today. Like, lawlessness is a terrible idea. It's the opposite of justice. So you have to have a system in place, and yes, the system has to work. If the system is sifting through facts and considering the actual truth at hand and how justice can be properly implemented. But we need to be honest, the system doesn't always do that. And sometimes the system doesn't do that because they are recognizing faces, right? I am reflexively, instinctively, in my guts, pro-law enforcement. I have too many friends I grew up with that I would walk through fire for that are cops, good ones. Honest men, decent men. If I recognize their face and say, yeah, the cops have a tough job. I'm sorry, if a cop has done an awful, atrocious, unjust thing, that's got to be called out. And if God's people don't call it out, why should we have any credibility in the rest of the conversation? So we can't just let the system work. If it's manifestly clear that the system has been corrupted. And if I make that point, and you say, yes, but we got to tear the entire system down, then you're a fool. Sorry, probably shouldn't have said it that way. You're being foolish, right? You are trying to rectify an injustice with an injustice, and a particularly foolish one at that. But you see what I mean? You cannot have a conversation about a thing with these definitions in mind in our current climate. It's very difficult. We're too quick to jump to one side or the other and then just start shouting the slogans at one another. And we can't have it. Sorry, we can't have it. I'm not saying to correct any of you. I'm just maybe I'm shouting at clouds, but we're just not good enough for God's people. So, render true judgments, really do justice, pursue it, chase after it. But while you're doing that, how about show kindness? Uphold mercy for people that are made in God's image. Maybe they're confused. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're idiots. Maybe they're bad. I don't see excuses built into the text that say, oh, if that's true, stop showing kindness. Just go for justice, right? God doesn't give his people that out. Well, I know we should go after justice, but come on, God, they're really mean and nasty. I don't care. Show kindness. Don't excuse evil. Don't stand by while wrong is being done and then call it good. But show kindness. Act mercifully toward one another. If one another still defines human relationships. It's weird. They're just shouting at people like they're objects that are meant to absorb our shouts. Just like strange and sort of sad in addition to a lot of other things. Render true justice, show kindness, mercy to one another. Or do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Father, thank you for your word, for your time, for your presence in our midst. Frankly, Lord, I just have to say I'm troubled and sad. Yes, I'm angry. I hope that doesn't come out too much. And if it does, I hope it's appropriate. Any of these things, Lord, that are slights or misapplications of what I'm supposed to be doing here, I apologize. Pray that I'll receive forgiveness from you and from my church family here. But to the extent, Lord, that your word is moving us toward the standards we're trying to shoot for here, then I don't apologize for it. I ask that you would animate it in our hearts. I ask that you would help us to rise up, take the right stands for the right things at the right time, be people who follow Jesus and try to live up to his calling, who try to represent him well, both in pursuing justice and in showing kindness to people. So help your words, Lord, to penetrate our hearts today. Help us as we talk and pray with one another to edify each other in how to do these things. Help us to be comforted in a time of pain. Help us to grieve properly in a time of lamentation. Help us to, above all, be grateful for what we have and everything you've done through Jesus in our lives. As we walk away from here, Lord, I pray that we be walking toward each other in discussion, in edifying, encouragement, and in prayer. If there are any prayer needs here, Lord, I pray that as we sit down with each other in like smaller groups, that you would help those get addressed in a way that is dominated by looking for the right thing to do and doing it in a loving and kind way. So thank you for the time you've set apart for us here. May it be accepted by you as worship in all the rest of our daily lives and our week ahead, Lord. I pray that you'll be moving by the power of your Spirit to help us live up to these ideals. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for the fellowship that we have here. Thank you for the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and his life living in us that brings us here today. It's for his sake. We pray in his name. Amen.